All right, good morning, everybody. We are back at day two with Generation Analog. We're so excited for this upcoming day of panels, a lot of really exciting things. So we are here for the very first panel on uncanny relationships. Just as a reminder, at Generation Analog, we don't read bios out loud, but all of our panelists have already put their bios in the Discord, so please feel free to go there and check it out. So we're going to get started with our very first panelist of the day. We have Sharang Biswas, who will be presenting first. Leigh.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. And there we go. I'm sharing. Can everyone see? Amazing.
Yes, looks perfect.
I didn't hear a no. Okay, my name is Sharang Biswas, and I will be talking about the TTRPG Bluebeard's Bride today with themes of dread, feminine fear, and complicity. So, a little about me. I'm a game designer, artist, and writer. I teach at a couple of different schools. I write for different publications as a freelancer. I've also won some game design awards. I've worked on lots of games, some my own, some of these bigger titles that you might recognize. And today, we're going to talk about the TTRPG Bluebeard's Bride. Bluebeard's Bride is a game that recreates, in a sense, or asks the players to recreate the folk tale of Bluebeard. To boil that down really quickly for you, it's a young wife arrives in her new husband Bluebeard's mansion. He tells her, you can explore anything in the mansion except this one tiny room while I'm away. She ends up exploring that tiny room. She finds the dismembered bodies of all the previous wives, and then Bluebeard arrives and finds out. In some versions of the story, he kills her, and in some versions, he is saved. In the older versions, he kills her. Now, players take on the role of different fragments of the bride's mind, playing together as one bride. Now, this is a game that understands itself as a game of feminine horror. The creators talked about this and writes about this a long time. And the game attempts to illuminate misogynistic troubles that women face in contemporary society and have faced for a long time. Now, in some ways, the game is a little bit traditional. It descends from the Powered by Apocalypse tradition of games by the Bakers, and it has a game master known as the Groundskeeper and uses dice resolution. However, in many ways, as we'll talk about today, it is very unusual. Now, the core loop of this game asks the player, the bride, to investigate the house to try and learn the truth about their husband. Is their husband a good person or a bad person? And they investigate a series of rooms, and it's a horror game. They then react to the monstrosities they find within the room. Now, I'm using react because the key thing to understanding this game is this idea of lack of agency. Players can do very little when faced with the horrors and terrors of this house. There's no way to kill the monsters. You can subdue them slightly. You can placate them a bit, but you can't defeat them ever. Additionally, the ending of the game is known. At the start of the game, the DM will read out the story of Bluebeard, and you know that the ending is going to be sticky. There are a couple of choices of the endings, but they're all bad for the bride. Players cannot actually affect very much. Which brings me to my thesis, which is that as a game of feminine horror, Bluebeard's Bride forces players to not only confront the theme of domestic violence, but also be complicit in it. Now, the game has a rich substrate to draw on simply by virtue of being a game about haunted houses, right? This idea of haunted houses carries associations, tropes, and hundreds and hundreds of years of reference that allows the game designers to make their argument without having to have the players think too much. They can draw on the associations they already have. As Barry Curtis writes in his book, Dark Places, quote, ghosts and the dark places where they dwell have served as powerful metaphors for persistent themes of loss, memory, retribution, and confrontation with unacknowledged and unresolved histories, right? If you are a consumer of Gothic horror fiction, for example, you know that they tend to be about the past rearing up and affecting the present, and perhaps recreating the cycles of terror and violence, often instigated by sociological and social reasons, onto the present. Now, Bluebeard's bride underscores this idea again and again because the bride, the players, are confronted repeatedly with the former brides of Bluebeard in the form of monstrosities and ghosts. And these brides tend to try and inflict the very terrors that they underwent onto this new bride, the past rearing itself up again. And these brides you find by exploring the rooms of this house. The core loop is that players explore rooms and find these terrors within and learn about what happened to the previous brides. In this way, Bluebeard's house becomes what Stephen Graham Jones calls a hungry house versus a stay-away house. A stay-away haunted house wants to keep people from entering. It wants to be isolated and alone. A hungry house draws people in order to consume them, and in our case, turn them into part of the house and make them complicit. Jones writes, quote, "Hungry houses aren't complete without people to digest for seasons or decades or centuries. A hungry house has to seduce you into its long embrace. A hungry house knows the injuries you've been nursing in secret, and it uses them against you." Again, it's all about complicity. And here, ultimately, the bride will succumb to the darkness of this house and reenact some of that. Now, one of the main ways that the players mechanically do this is through the mechanic of keys. Whenever the bride wants to enter a new room, they describe to the groundskeeper, the GM, what kind of key they're putting into the lock. They can describe anything they want. It could be an ordinary key. This is a metal key with filigree on it. Or it could be something fanciful. This is a key made of green fire. When I first ran the game to my sister, she made a glass key full of loose baby's teeth that rattled when the key moved. Now, the GM then uses the key to, on the fly, without any prior preparation, create the room that the bride will explore. They can do this thematically. So in the case of my sister's key, they might be like, oh, this used to be the children's playroom. Or they can do it aesthetically. Oh, this is a room with taxidermied animals with really prominent teeth everywhere, for example. Then the GM will, the groundskeeper will use the room threats that the game provides them with. There are 4 major pillars of this, each attached to one area of misogyny that women experience, according to the authors of the game. The body and beauty standards often, motherhood, religion, especially as applied punitively to women, and sexuality, especially as applied punitively to women. And within the room, the GM will then use the room moves that are tied to the theme they have picked and tied to the description they've come up with based on the key to inflict horror on the bride and underscore these themes of feminine horror. Now, this is mainly done through the usually mundane objects in the room acting in decidedly unmundane ways. So, for example, you might try and lie on that couch, but then the couch might begin to smother you like an overprotective mother. Or you might try and pour some tea, and instead of tea, you will end up with menstrual blood, for example. Now, like I said, haunted houses come with a lot of associations, and this idea of mundane objects is well-trod territory. Curtis writes, quote, "Memory consigned to objects, images, and documents play an important figurative role in the mise en scène of the haunted house," end quote. Except that Curtis, of course, is talking about film and how the mise en scène is directed by authorial intent. In our case, the mise en scène is made complicitly or in complicity with the player themselves, right? Because the player has, one, designed this key that they tell the GM about. The GM then uses that key to fill this haunted room. And on top of that, the player then decides which objects to engage with within this room, which signals the GM that, this is now going to be the haunted object. I am going to use my room move. Furthermore, The GM will never, because there's no planning involved, the GM doesn't have in their head, these are the truths of what Bluebeard has done to his brides. The GM will present you these horrors, and then players interpret those horrors to think about what Bluebeard has done and what is going on, whether or not Bluebeard is a good or bad man. As the game says, quote, there is no flinching away from it. The horror you unlock will be what it will be, and you must find your own meaning. And it is within this construction of meaning that players find complicity with the terrors that the house inflict, because they, again, co-create this terror. This is most prevalent in the token mechanic that appears in the game. So when a player has faced the horrors of the room, when they want to leave a room, they must propose a truth. If they propose a truth about Bluebeard being a good man, they take a token of faithfulness. And if they propose a truth about the player being a bad man, they take a token of disloyalty. Now, as an example, let's say in a room you find a monstrous bride who starts cutting off their own flesh in order to lose weight and encouraging the bride to do so to look beautiful for Bluebeard. When the players want to leave the room, they may propose, oh, this is entirely this monstrous bride's fault. Bluebeard has done no wrong. If she didn't eat well and exercise enough to look beautiful for her husband, it is totally appropriate and it's totally her fault that she's cutting off her own flesh. She's terrible, right? Nothing wrong with Bluebeard. Here, the players would take a token of faithfulness and they would heal a trauma. Trauma is the health mechanic of this game. By saying that their husband is amazing, players can heal a trauma and stay within the game. If, on the other hand, they say, oh my God, what did Bluebeard drive this woman to do? That's horrible. He's a bad man. They would take a token of disloyalty and take a trauma, endangering their existence within the game, right, by losing health. Now, this mechanic models cycles of domestic violence that we see in the real world, right? Victims, often women at the hands of men, not exclusively, but often, often rationalize the violence done against them. Oh, I deserve this, I did a bad thing, in order to preserve their health, because if they don't, their intimate partner will inflict more of this violence on them. So this recreates, this discusses that cycle, and by forcing players to rationalize the violence and the horribleness in order to stay within the world of the game, to stay to have their health and to not shatter, as the game calls it, they are complicit, in a sense, in the violence that Bluebeard inflicts, because they are creating and rationalizing it within the magic circle, the fiction of the game, ultimately becoming monsters themselves, perhaps. As the game says, quote, the thinnest line separates the bride from the abominations that live here. Sometimes that line will blur or disappear entirely. You will become a monstrous bride. So, Bluebeard's bride makes players complicit in cycles of intimate partner and domestic violence by, one, making the player powerless to do various things, meaning they have to go along with the few things they can do, by having the players co-create the very terrors that they undergo as the bride, and by forcing them to rationalize the reasons behind this terror, emulating cycles of domestic violence and underscoring the veracity and moral righteousness of those cycles for the very bride that they embody. So in conclusion, as Curtis writes, quote, all houses are haunted by memories, by the history of their sites, by their owners' fantasies and projections, or by the significance they acquire for agents or strangers. Bluebeard's house is full of terror, one that is simultaneously supernatural and societal, that exists in broken objects and broken people. It resides in bedrooms, kitchens, and sewing rooms. It suffuses lived spaces, particularly women's spaces. But ultimately, this terror originates from the minds of the players and the GMs as they reconstruct and are complicit in cycles of domestic violence and abuse. And that, of course, might be the true horror that the game attempts to illuminate. Thank you so much. I'm Sharang Biswas. You can find me on socials. All images here are taken from the Bluebeard suite of products. I hope that was interesting, and I'll see you in Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharang, and perfect on time. Much appreciated. Bluebeard's Bride is one of those games that I've had on my shelf for many years and haven't felt like I'm ready to play it because it seems very intense. This was a wonderful presentation. Okay, so up next, I'd like to introduce Aasa Timonen and Ian Sturrock. And Sharang, if you wouldn't mind turning off your camera. And then Aasa and Ian, if you can both turn yours on, unless you're taking turns, that's okay.
Ian will start,
and then,
so I will come after him.
Okay, perfect. And then just a reminder to everybody who's attending right now, please go ahead and if you have questions for the panelists, we'll be doing it at the end. Please do put it in the Zoom Q&A, because we will have difficulty pouring through all of the amazing comments in Discord. All right, well then Aasa and Ian, I will hand it over to you. Take it away.
Cool, thank you very much. Is that now shared or not? No, it's not, is it? There we go. Right. Okay.
Perfect. Looks good.
So we're here to talk about a particular faction in Warhammer 40k. We met as part of the now how do I actually get on to the next bit? Apparently with difficulty if I am sharing on a laptop. Just a moment.
The arrow keys should work.
Okay, let's try that again, see if I can do that from there. How's that? So yeah, Tom Appley and I wrote an article a couple of years back about the UK tabletop RPG scenes, particularly about Fiend Folio. And from that, we thought, okay, there's a lot more to say about this kind of era, really crucial era in kind of tabletop game design and history, kind of late 70s to late 70s to late 80s in the UK. And so we started this UK game scenes project. This is just to give you a little bit of background about how
Ian, sorry, I'm sorry, your slides are not showing. You're showing only the first slide.
Thank you. Let's see if that. Oh, there we go. Right.
No,
so that is the aforementioned article. Thank you, Aasa. So we got a lot of interview material from this and ended up deciding, okay, there's a lot more potential out of here rather than just this one journal article. Let's look at making a whole project. And so we picked Warhammer 40,000 actually as the cutoff date. That's such a huge subject in and of itself. So really our presentation today is it's growing out of this UK game scenes project that we did a load of work on in Tampere earlier this year, but it's not strictly a part of it. But just to give you an insight into that background, key players in the UK at the time were Citadel Miniatures, TSI UK, as distinct from the American one, the publishers of D&D, and Games Workshop, again at the time, a distinct entity from Citadel Miniatures. They do end up kind of merging during this history. And we have a couple of key publications in that era, White Dwarf, the house organ of Games Workshop, and Imagine, which is being produced by TSI UK. There's also a massive fanzine culture. Really, in the pre-internet days, it's hard to undersell just how much nerd culture was in the world of fanzines, and people would subscribe to these by mail order. Generally, there were a few game shops that would sell them in person, but generally you're eagerly awaiting for the postal person to drop them through your letterbox and find out what the kind of geeky news is that month. And there's a bit of a funnel, I suppose, from fanzine editor to White Dwarf contributor to pro game designer in this era. So all that is important to understanding that history of Games Workshop and so on. So we had a bunch of methods. We have a load of interviews already, and we're carrying out a few more from people who were prominent on the scene in this era. we looked at secondary sources, existing interviews and blogs. There's quite a lot of blogs on the early history of Games Workshop out there. And we've done some close readings of games and scenarios. And one of those is what we'll talk about today, mostly Aasa. A bit of archival research, a little look at internet sources. We're a bit wary of OSR forums for what should be obvious reasons, I think. So, on to the Genestealer cult themselves. This is a group of aliens within the setting, a kind of human-alien hybrid cult, obviously quite influenced by the Alien movie series. They're an auxiliary force of these kind of hybrids who hide among the population of cities using guerrilla warfare tactics to try to overthrow planetary governments. And they're first introduced in the late 80s, 1989, and then reintroduced in 2016. And they're a really fascinating group to analyze, I suppose, or faction. They're part of the native population, but they're also seen as these kind of foreign invaders coming from outside of the home, subverting it, attacking the status quo, being different. So far we've done a close reading of the current codex, which is Games Workshop's word for its kind of big book about that army. It'll have a mixture of rules and what they call fluff, the kind of background text and the world building as we might see it. So we looked at just the first 6 or so pages, the intro material, and we use these lenses. We're using the kind of Bizokian Tannenbaum style close reading of video games, but applying it to an analog game. And we used lenses of extremism and domestic terrorism, monstrosity and aliens, deviance, the home, particularly when the home is invaded, defended or corrupted, and industrial and working class rebellion. And initially, we've just looked at word frequencies that are associated with those. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the very first one of those, and then I'll hand over to Aasa, just to kind of give you an idea of that, that method. So from a monstrosity and alienness perspective, we had 18 mentions of monstrousness, hideousness, nightmarishness, terror or terrifying stuff, fangs or claws or other natural weapons, horror, and then about 14 mentions of alien or xenos, a few mentions of hunt, insect or chitinous qualities, and a few mentions of beast. And I'm going to hand over to Aasa, who will tell you how we interpreted all of that lot. I guess I should end sharing first, because I hear there are some differences in the slides now. Go for it.
No, wrong. But let's not. And you just see now my slides, right?
We see your whole window.
Do you see my notes as well?
Yes.
All right. I'm trying to not to show my written notes. Now? Nope.
No, we see the same thing. But you might need to just choose a different window when you're sharing from Zoom.
Okay. Sorry. You are screen sharing. Yep. Share that. Did anything change? No, probably not.
No.
Then I'm just gonna do this and hope I remember everything that's needed to remember. So we're here, and I'm actually gonna need my notes for this, because everything that I've written is in my notes. So you're not gonna. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to go here. I'm sorry. If I want to only show the presentation view, because this is how I've kind of planned to do this. So I'm not sure your screen sharing. Now if I do this. No.
No,
Still
it hasn't
no.
changed.
Yeah, all right.
I think it's fine to see the notes anyway. I mean,
all right, we are gonna go with the notes then, because I wanna get this going, and I need to read a bit. All right,
That's
so
perfect now.
and what?
You got it. Now we just see the slide.
Oh, cool, nice, it worked. I don't know how.
Well done.
All right, so let's move to deviants. There were many mentions of like words that are associated with non-humanity, such as brood, swarm, seed, spore, and also the sexual metaphors relating to like how the cultists spread and how they are described in that sense. Hybrid, mutated, abhuman, pure strain, and also like psychic and hypnotic, squirm, twisted, warped, insanity, stigmata. And the monstrosity and alienness of the cults is built upon this sort of physical othering, the act of dehumanization by language. The cultists are insect-like, parasites, chitinous with fangs and claws. They're also weird and uncanny in their humanity, indescribably wrong in their corruption, which is spread via subterfuge. They are weird and different. In other words, they are queer. A queer reading of the cults can be seen as a scaremongering, but queerness is also tied strongly to the other themes of the text, such as working class rebellion, labor issues, and even found family issues. And there are key words used in these books that relate to this kind of like aberration and abnormality. There's a unit in the army called just aberrants, which is very much tied to this like old words for like aberrant sexuality and aberrant behavior. This also links to this subfaction within gene-stealer cults called the Twisted Helix, which is heavily based on medical experimentation and chemical augmentation, led by these aristocratic degenerates, bring in mind this 19th century queer-coded fiction, such like House of Usher and stuff like that. And these people are deliberately spreading the infected genetic material via syringes, and it's very hard not to think of like different moral panics related to mass inoculations or even AIDS panic in that regard. Major theme also is the home and the defense, the invasion and corruption of the home. Gene-stealer cults are both the invader and the defender of the home. The neophytes of the cult are third-generation citizens by their nature, not a migratory army, as their insectile coding might suggest. As an army formed of labor forces, their roots in the world they inhabit run deep. If the planet they inhabit is in secret would come under attack from another foe, they rise to defend this home. So they are less like ideas of nests and hive of insects in that regard. They are inhabitants of their worlds where they are from, yet they are also kind of these invaders. And these ties to themes of extremism and domestic terrorism. The cults are essentially in the grips of a religious fervor that is led to a labor unrest. Cults await the day of ascension when their star gods arrive to lift them to heaven. As the 2019 Gene-stealer cult model line reveal video said, the humanity has always looked to the stars for enlightenment, and at last the stars have answered. The cult activities then build on this hegemonic faith in star gods, propaganda that obfuscates the true intentions of these beings and the divine justification for their insurrectional actions for their gods. The only true gods are on their side. This use of religious soft power drives the common people of the cult to fanaticism and acts of martyrdom, as well as inhabit spaces outside of Imperial's regular societal structures. The cults are also led by literal patriarchs, the sire of the original infestation, which sits at the top of the cult structures, where the leader forms a corrupted family of sort. But the patriarch is in reality a predator, using the faithful of his family as tools for his own purposes. Patriarchal structures of the cults has interesting relation related to this home and ideas of domesticness, and also the queer readings of the cult. And then we learn to the industry and working class rebellion. The working class rebellion of the cults is a recent dynamic in the presentation of the faction, where the tools of the oppression are turned against the oppressors. G-steel cults fight using mining trucks, drills, pickaxes, and homemade explosives, using the tools of their trade and grounding them more to the home environment and the workplace of their planet. The text also relates by calling them unwitting dupes or lumpen to the idea of the lumpen proletariat from Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth from 1963, as these unwitting dupes whose false class consciousness does not drive them to overthrow the imperium due to political reasons, but for religious fervor and doomsday cult mentality. And then Ian had some words to say about the rusted claw.
Yeah, I mean, also on that, the proletariat aspect, it's worth bearing in mind the context of this being a UK company. And so the memory of the miners' strike will be really, really vivid amongst a lot of the designers here. You know, this was seen as the miners were even stated by Thatcher as this enemy within. You know, that notion of turning them into an evil is really notable here. So yeah, the Rusted Claw are another of those factions, a little like the Twisted Helix. And they are very much seen as this kind of pseudo-Bedouin or pseudo-Arab vibe that you can't see it in the visual look of them, although that's more for, I suppose, intellectual property reasons. You know, Games Workshop wants you to use their own miniatures rather than making a bunch of Arab style or desert nomad style looking ones. But you can sort of see in the terminology used around them that they are very much maybe more associated with pop cultural depictions of nomadic and Arab cultures. You know, the kind of Dune vibes are really, really clear. Warhammer 40k is always drawn from other pop cultural elements, especially classic SF works. And if you look at the parallels between the two settings, both kind of retro-futurist, gothic, medievalist, religious and imperial, it's really, really clear that Dune was a massive influence. It's worth, I think, considering as well that there's a philosophical code. I'm not sure this is intentional or not, but desert nomad culture philosophically suggests anti-authoritarian desires for freedom or loneliness, at least when viewed from kind of European eyes, and is also seen as foreignness and isolation. All this kind of comes out of Camus' depiction of these cultures in Exile in the Kingdom, 1957. It's really, really clear there's a thematic link here between Orientalist fears of these jihadi fanatics and all of the other threats to the status quo are kind of bundled together in these depictions. Queer folks, working class people. The overall viewpoint shown here by the designers, to my mind, is a very conservative or even reactionary one. You'd expect this to be there in universe. The Imperium of Man is intolerant. You know, it's a hidebound bureaucracy verging on fascism. But this also hints at a similar kind of corporate culture on behalf of the game designers and Games Workshop, the corporation as well.
We're going to run us home. Initial findings is that genocidal cults is a representation of class and otherness, following this idea of negative estrangement as established by Holmes in 2003, where this possible intention is to create negative sentiments towards estranged subjects. This estrangement can paradoxically both create an enemy that is more evil, but also acts as an exploration of issues relating to class inequality, insurgents, movements, and otherness. The estrangement works especially in othering the subjects from lenses relating to minorities in home environments, be it refugees or migrants or queer people. This may end up resembling many contemporary far-right waves of moral panic over queer degeneracy or migrant caravans, or even older conspiracy theories relating to cultural Marxism. And our future plans for this project is we are going to have another paper at Warhammer Conference, very hopefully. And we've found a lot of other themes, but a lot of other lenses to look at this. And there's a lot of potential future research there. I've said multiple times that Genestealer cults is a rich text to explore. And I think we're going to have a lot to do there, just not to find a place for it at this point. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Again, perfect on time. That was a really fascinating deep dive into, I think Warhammer deserves a lot more attention since it's so much in the public eye. That was great. All right, so up next, we are introducing MN Kugler. So Emily, if you would like to turn your camera on, and Ian and Aasa, you're already off. And just a reminder to everybody, all of the amazing panelists, their bios are in Discord. So if you'd like to learn more about them, please check that out. Okay. All right, Emily, looks like you're sharing and ready to go. So whenever you're ready, take it away.
All right, and I have a timer going, so hopefully that will also help. All right, so we're going to look at something I have been obsessing about and I'm trying to form an argument around, and this is sort of where I'm at right now. If you want to access the links, my slides are also available in the Discord, or you can just use the Menti code. Mentimeter is really good if you need to not fiddle with your slides. and have very limited design options. Okay, so what we're going to look at, not a bio, but a little bit of where I'm coming from, what I'm arguing, some brief terms. I'm also interested in people thinking about better terms than what I'm coming up with right now. And then we're going to look at the, for lack of a better term, actual play Kollok. We're going to think about it as the actual play, its plot, its main narratives focusing very much on being in a post-pandemic world with its narratives of isolation. We're also going to think of the way that this actual play for its parent company, Hyper Rabbit, serves as an advertisement. And also the thing that I'm really intrigued by with this is the way that the audience can become player characters within this. Okay, so who am I? I teach at Howard. It's a historically Black college. I look at a lot of different things, which when people ask, they're like, this looks very diverse or very scattered or like you can't focus. But really what I'm interested in, how the stories we tell about ourselves in the past sort of shape identity. And this is one of the reasons I'm very much drawn to Kollok. Occasionally I appear online or in public for either the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project or the YouTube channel I have with Dr. M. Friedman, Critical Prof. She's on there a lot more. I try to just pop up maybe once a year on there. And if you want more, I have, these links are available in the Discord, including land acknowledgements and things like that. All right, so there will be minimum spoilers about this actual play. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you do. You can watch it on YouTube. You can also watch it on Twitch. I'm also going to say, like, the main thing you need to know is that it's weird. The central narratives of Kollok deal with nostalgia, isolation due to pandemic and technology, and resistance to late stage capitalism. But if we think about what this actually is, they describe it as a live interaction series. You might see me, by the way, do Hyper RPG, which is the URL, versus Hyper Rabbit or Hyper. There's ways that the company goes by multiple terms. It's an actual play. It's a homebrew on Kids on Bikes. That's continued on. It's shot like a multi-camera drama, live. There are physical props, and there's an Unreal Engine 5 background changing along with the lighting as the story evolves. They shoot live for about 3 to 4 hours with 2 casts pursuing interlinked narratives, one set in 2022, a dystopic 2022, and the other is set in sort of flashes back between 1991 and actually it's more 2021, but it feels very 2022. There's interweaving of audience interactions from social media. There's real advertisements for other things. It was airing on Fear HQ, which is AMC's Twitch channel, along with ads that are actually part of the narrative, part of the dystopia. Malika and Lim Ubeg both started out with Geeks and Sundry. And if you're familiar with their work, or especially Zach's works there, some of the ads will seem the dystopic ads will seem a little familiar. And there's sort of a nod to it that way. There's also fan art of tarot cards. It never shows up in the narrative, but there's amazing work, which I will save for a whole other presentation. But the artwork done for the tarot cards also have this outer narrative way of interpreting the characters. They also developed an app for the audience to play the world between streams in a way that shapes what we might think of the actual playing narrative. So all of this points to the tensions between performing a narrative as commodity to be consumed and questioning the systemic pressures to make play profitable. So on one hand, the plot, the stories, the tensions coming up are constantly about resisting power structures, including capitalistic ones. At the same time, there are sort of satiric ads, so modeling stories, the way the story form comes to you in between acts as an advertisement that's not really an advertisement, but a continuation of the story of living in dystopia. On the other hand, it, as we'll talk about later, does act as an ad for what this studio can do. It also highlights the audience's role as an active potential player characters in the game narrative, as well as having us think about the way we play as we consume in the troubling ways that can work together. Okay, some quick terminology, which I promise we won't go too much into. I'm using metagame. I'm not sure how much I love this term, but if we think about this, of what meaning I'm going with it, Kollok and Lemu's piece from Configurations earlier this year, I think what they discussed Valve as both having, for example, games and things interact with each other, forming part of the metagame, but also the way that Valve's distribution service Steam is the way you're interacting with them, the way there's a reviewing, spectating, reviewing, socializing, and how do we encounter this, right? So there's the way that narratives are connected, but there's also the way that we're consuming them and how is this being brought to us. And keeping this brief, you can access my slides about things I think are also have been useful from helping me think about this. It works. Okay. How is metagaming a useful way of thinking about Kollok as actual play, as an advertisement, as its audience's player characters, or something else be more useful, like online LARP, which would maybe focus on more of the audience, more of the way the audience/player characters interact with it. And I'm sorry, I've started tweaking things. So when we think about the narratology of this, last bits of terminology, I am doing a highly abridged paraphrase of Friedman. But what I find particularly interesting is, okay, how do we talk about this? Traditionally, if we were talking just about a tabletop role-playing game, we might think about the GM and the character narration, right? The story you're creating together, the game, the way that the dice rolls, the system that you're using, and we might think about table talk. When we think about this being streamed, right, as an actual play, what does it mean to be a performance? How do fan interactions going with this? And one of the things I found useful about Friedman's work is thinking about how once that narrative leaves the hands of the players, what does it become outside of this? How does discourse, the different ways people might consume it go through this? And she's developed this model further, but in particular, I'm interested in how the narrative world and the game itself exists beyond the stream. There's how people, there's us watching it play, but also what does it mean that that's not actually all of the game? So Kollok, what is it? This is building off of previous campaigns. We're going to have a little bit of information on this. I'm not going to go too much in the stories, but this is sort of thinking about the way that this has been going as an actual play. So the first few iterations of this, we're using Kids on Bikes fairly much as it's played, right? It starts to get modified, including new dice, with the 2022 version going through this. And there are some differences to think about for this. It's modified. We have the continued unreliable narrator GM, the driver. They frame it as a live interactive narrative series. They're also going for this idea of immersion. And this is the season where they partnered with AMC and they're streaming on Fear HQ instead of on their own Twitch going forward. So what is this story? Is thinking about how we interact with this. This airs during a time of when we still have widespread social distancing. And the actual play both returns to the world of its 2019 series, Kollok 1991 and Kollok 1991 Bleach, but with thematic and mechanical emphasis on being homebound. The player characters interweave an oral history of plague that leads to quarantining of individuals, and in one case, a cultural shift of the community into permanent social distancing. It also relies heavily on viewer, and I would sort of say like a viewer as player character interactions. Each live episode simultaneously streamed on AMC's Fear HQ, Twitch and YouTube channels was shot with multiple cameras on a physical set that blended virtual elements amidst props, costumes, and makeup. The players sat around a table in costume. Occasionally, other figures, sometimes masks, came into, sometimes unknown to the cast, would come in. They might whisper, they might touch them, they observe. Rarely seen there's a crew operating in the virtual production, lights, music, cameras, etc. All this happening at once. Meanwhile, as it's airing, social media comments on Twitch and Twitter, the only thing I did name is Twitter, would appear during the episodes as well as during the narratives presented as commercials mixed into actual advertising breaks, right? So we have this blending of things going forward, and it's very much encouraging participation, but it's still encouraging participation as a as sort of an audience member, as someone consuming it as a viewer, yet it's also yet at the same time there's that sense of you're participating in a way. This idea of isolation is being through it. You might have people communicating through screens within the narrative, and you through your screen at home are participating. The other thing I want to look at is thinking about how it's being advertised. So if we go to Hyper's site, we see their different, we see their work, if we look at their different works, this may look different than other actual plays, right? Because of how they're framing it. So for example, there's other specials I feel they could do, but they highlight one of the episodes from the campaign, the Council of Gods episode. And in it, right, if we think about how it's being framed on the site, right, there's how it's framed within the narrative and how this works. But again, you know, it's showing potential customers, potential sponsors and people to work with, what they can do for them, that's a fundraiser, that it's a 50 cast members and 30 crew, entirely live. We have the views, we have the sense of how is this a special event. When we go to Kollok as itself on the works page, again, it is presented as an IP, as something they develop. And I think interestingly, as they go through it, how are they framing it? They're saying, how are we framing this, not so much as the story, but as a studio, because this is how they frame most of the website. They do highlight the actual play here. But again, if we compare this to other sites for other actual plays, the audience that they're putting this to is different, is not necessarily the same as their viewer audience. I'm also going to highlight that when it was airing, it was much more focused on the audience and who's viewing at the time. Post-airing, it becomes a sign of what they can do for other clients. And these are some interesting links that I found for it. And that was in case the internet failed. But between streams, there was the server. And this is where you were asked to create your character existing in this world to, in the, you know, they plug it as an app designed for the site. But you are meant to do your own story. You're interacting. And the server you're on is the server that the main character in the actual plays are using. You impact them. When they reveal that they've held back information from the server, the audience who are playing the game react as characters. As we're playing, you're forming relationships and stories separate from what is aired. And occasionally the characters created did appear and were performed on the actual plays. And it's this aspect that I'm thinking, what are the different audiences? What does it mean when part of your audience is looking for corporate clients for growing your studio? And to what extent, and what do we also do when the audience is playing along and playing the game? And to what extent, again, my sort of questions of, does metagaming help with this? Or should this be viewed more as a LARP? Or how do we talk about this hybrid nature of, as actual plays become quote unquote professionalized and there's issues with that, what are the levels that we talk about, and who, when we say the audience, who is the audience, and what are the different roles that they have with that narrative? Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. That one's new for me, so I'm very curious
Oh,
to
I'm
check
also
it out. It looks
I've
really
left out
interesting.
so much. Like if you go into it, like you have no idea how high production and beautiful and bizarre it is.
Yeah,
And
it
that,
sounds
yeah, I
great.
cry during it, but like, but no, this is the more how I'm trying to think about it part. But yeah,
Very interesting. Thank
watch
you
it.
so much, Emily. All right, so now we will move on to our final panelist for this panel. We have Megs Tyler. So Megs, if you would like to turn on your camera. And then just a reminder, if you are planning to share your video, remember to click the sound share when you share your screen.
Yeah, I might breeze past it, but
no worries. All right, well, whenever you're ready, take it away, Megs.
is my screen sharing? Oop. I believe I'm sharing, right? And then, oop,
we're seeing your whole browser right now, or your whole screen, I think, because we see your.
Okay, let's see here. Present to view, or wait, no, just hit my present button. Okay. Oh wait, whoop. All right.
Great.
So, all right, okay. So my presentation is titled Playing Games and Relationships, How Fog of Love Relocates Social Deduction. I'm going to try to go a little bit fast because we're a little bit over time, but I will try to hit most of the main points. So the first thing I want to do is kind of contextualize the game Fog of Love, Jacob Jaskov's Fog of Love from 2017, within the context of kind of the broader modern hobby game scene, right? So hobby games are typically thought of as either kind of these like combat-focused Ameritrash games or these kind of worker placement, procedural type, cerebral Euro type games. But then there's kind of another very popular genre of game that's a little bit like doesn't really fit into either section, and that is social deduction. And so social deduction is kind of popular with either big groups, right? So the really big game right now is Blood on the Clock Tower, right? And that kind of draws from other kind of previous games, One Night Ultimate Werewolf, which is then kind of itself a mix of werewolf, right? So like it's popular in these big party settings where there's 15 people and you're kind of trying to figure out who the potential killer is. And then they're also popular, but there's another kind of version of social deduction that Fog of Love is a little bit more similar to, where it's kind of like a hardcore, more of a hardcore audience, right? And that kind of draws from the tradition of Battlestar Galactica, the board game from 2008, and then Nemesis from 2018, which came out a little bit after Fog of Love. I think that Nemesis is probably the most similar in terms of how that social deduction works. So social deduction in that context, right? You're kind of, you have some kind of objective, and you're also doing a little bit of resource management, and you're trying to figure out who it is that is potentially messing up your kind of effort to maintain your group's resources. So, wait, but this is pretty different from the other games, right? That's right, because Fog of Love is a board game for women. Apparently they make those, it's shocking. So basically, right, in contrast to kind of the like gory werewolf games or the kind of more like it's sci-fi Nemesis or Battlestar Galactica, right? This is a game that kind of relocates social deduction, right? It takes it from game night to date night. It is only for 2 players, which very few social deduction games attempt to do. And it rethemes it as kind of a romantic comedy. The game's tagline is the romantic, a board game as a romantic comedy. So basically, to very briefly go over the mechanics, essentially, you are kind of half role playing, half playing a social deduction game. You get a little bit of like a prompt to start in terms of how your 2 kind of characters met, right? Had their little meet cute. And then you basically begin to create your character. While the example here has like a female-looking silhouette and a male-looking silhouette, you can choose to have like a same-sex couple and flip either of those cards. So you could have the guy over here or a guy over here on pink or a lady over here on blue. And essentially you, as the game goes on, there's a little bit of resource management similar to other social deduction games where you are trying to kind of figure out, you're trying to like work with the other person, right? Whenever you match the other person, you're going to increase your happiness, make your relationship better. But you're also trying to not like forget yourself. So you'll have some traits there that you that are related to these little sliders here. So you might want to be insincere, even though you realize that your partner over here wants to be sincere. So there's a little bit of negotiation in terms of the social deduction part is trying to figure out what it is that your partner is trying to do, what their end goal at the end of the game is, and how that can kind of work in with what your goal is. So basically, essentially, you are trying to deduce it that way. And in many ways, this type of deduction and kind of role selection is a little bit different from other games. So in a typical hidden objective game, you have one objective that you are working towards. In Fog of Love, you are kind of drafting objectives or roles, and in some ways, this kind of mirrors the ways that Dietering in Alibis for Adult Play kind of discusses ways that adult gamers can kind of choose to like have to kind of create a role, an acceptable way to play, right? So he gives the example of adults who need to create a reason for that, need to like say that, oh, I'm playing with my children, and so that's why it's okay for me to play this game. And so you kind of have to kind of create a reason for yourself for it to be okay for you to be playing this game. And so in many ways, Fog of Love kind of mirrors that in terms of I have to kind of like, I want to do my ultimate goal. I want to win the game, but I also want to make sure that I don't offend my partner. I don't do something that's like socially inappropriate. So the mechanics there are very interesting, right? And in many ways they mirror like the actual dynamics of a relationship, where if you are honest, the game is actually easier, which I find really fascinating. So, there's this really interesting kind of mechanical layer here, but the game actually has received a lot of kind of mixed reviews. So I won't go too into detail here, but here's some kind of like, it has a pretty negative reception on Reddit here, and we can see that here people are saying like, oh, it was too much role play. And then we go to Board Game Geek and people say, oh, I thought it would be a lot more role play, right? But one of the things that you definitely notice with all of the negative reviews is that people are not just talking about their feelings about the game, but they're also mentioning their wives in all of these reviews, right? So my wife and I played it, right? That sort of thing. I'm going to just highlight this one here. Maybe I just don't connect to romantic comedies. My wife and I played this and just took each other's lovers' quarrels super seriously, as if it were personal choices. As a result, I think we felt personally hurt when our game characters didn't get along. I really hated this experience. And this player says down here, they kind of have a similar feeling but they also say, it's also too complex for the intended audience. It's really more of a medium weight game, which requires a lot of thinking to win rather than the fun experience I was expecting. So the idea that the game is, too complex for the intended audience, or that it's a medium weight game, kind of gets me to my next point. While I and many reviewers find the game very interesting mechanically, it has very mixed reactions from fans because in part of the theming, it's seen as something that is supposed to be a gateway game, or a game that is going to eventually lead to you playing a different game. And so I might just breeze past my video here, but in this video here, there's a little bit of an example of a gateway game. So I might, I'll maybe just describe it really briefly, just so that I don't go over time here. But essentially, Quinn's from Shut Up and Sit Down here is telling people how to teach their friends how to play games. And there's a lot that I could say about this video, but he shows like 5 little games, right, that he thinks you could have people play before they play Pandemic. And then he also brings out Twilight Imperium and says, oh, and like if you also include this game, then you could get your friends to play Twilight Imperium, right? And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, the Twilight Imperium part, but he's kind of serious about the idea that like, oh, you need to play 5 games before you play these kind of more medium complexity game like Pandemic. And so I made a little bit of a joke thing here, and what if we were imagining that instead of trying to get your friends to play a board game, you need to get your friend to watch season 3 of Bridgerton. So I have 5 steps that they need to do, right? So, obviously there's watching the first 2 seasons, but we're going to introduce them with just a quick game of Bridgerton Love Letter, right? That's really short. It's not going to scare anybody. And then, of course, in order to understand it, right, they might want to watch Pride and Prejudice so that they know what it's satirizing, right? And I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here as well in terms of my reaction to Quinn here. But definitely there's a little bit of an idea that we can't, that many games can't really be seen for themselves and instead have to be seen as gateway games, as steps to a game that that the person introducing the game to their friends is kind of getting people to eventually. And in part of that is does come from the designer, right, and the way that it kind of it kind of interpolates or heralds its audience here. So this is from the Kickstarter, right? And basically they're kind of describing some of the playtesters, and I'm going to highlight here that they describe a couple here, and they say Morton has helped playtesting the game and is an avid player. His girlfriend Dorothy has a casual approach to games, but she is cunning in how she reads people. They're fans of the games and enjoy playing it together, jockeying for a common middle ground. So in this quote here, right, we both see that like the female partner, right, the girlfriend is Jen is kind of labeled as a casual gamer, right? There's a little bit of gendered labeling of casual versus serious gamers in some of the Kickstarter marketing, right? But also there's a distinction between their labor, right? So this is before the Kickstarter is funded. They're both play testers, but only Morton here is recognized as having done the labor of play testing here. And so the idea of kind of games as labor is kind of where I want to kind of end or like bring my presentation. So here, Tanya Paduta kind of actually asked women like, why are you a little bit less interested in games than men, right? Like, why might you play a little bit less? And ultimately, like, people didn't say that they'd been hate crimed, which is great. People didn't actually mention the theming as much, but the number one thing that they talked about was how they just didn't have time, right? We know that women often take on more domestic labor, right? They have less leisure time. And so in talking to women, right, these are some of the things that they said. So this woman says, I'm finding it's not just the time, but also the brain power. Because it is an actively engaged hobby, it takes more from you in terms of commitment than watching TV. I could stick on the Great British Bake Off and watch that. This takes no particular energy from me whatsoever. Because gaming is active rather than passive, it's about the time and energy. True leisure time is a massive barrier. Free time to play games with adults is very, very challenging for me to find. You're rushed, or you're stopping to juggle kids in the background, or you have to fight the kids to get the kids to bed early. And so in this case, right, particularly with this first quote, we see that women kind of recognize that, like, if you actually sit down to play like a super long game like Twilight Imperium, right, it's not necessarily that they don't know how to play, it's that they don't necessarily want to have to like engage at that level. Right, like they want to relax. They don't want to like be on during leisure time because they have less leisure time on average. And so I also want to kind of briefly talk about the labor of making games. So here is Jaskov talking about kind of designing the game as a game that he could play with his wife. And he mentions here that like his wife, enjoys it, but she's a bit tired of being a play tester. His wife is actually credited as a designer, but as someone who is a part of a board game designers guild, it is certainly something that I have noticed, like both in that context, but also at cons, is that many designers will have kind of labor from their partners kind of backing up the work that they want to do. That is often kind of invisibilized or not kind of treated the same way. So for example, there is a straight couple who comes to my guild meetings, and we just found out that at the last meeting that every single time that they've come, only the husband has been counted as the designer in the actual stats logs there. And so basically there's a lot of like gendered labor that can go into game designs, and often it's not really credited appropriately. All right, so my final thing is kind of questioning the idea of like, do we need to bring board games into this context? And if we do so should we be a little bit more careful, right? I think that you know, it's easy to see how like playtesting can be a type of labor in that context, but also you know, going back to my like slight joke about Bridgerton and the video that I kind of skipped over, sometimes I think that just the idea of like, oh, okay, I'm going to bring in this game, like I think that people are willing to play games, right? But it is often a little bit of labor, so we want to like, especially for people who don't play games. And so I think that there's some room to think about like, you know, if it's appropriate to try to like for board games to be moving so much into a domestic space and something that couples do rather than something that is in a game night space, right, in third places. Because often if one partner doesn't necessarily want to play games, right, then that's just another like kind of thing they have to do for that relationship. So I just wanted to kind of problematize the idea of domesticity. And then these are my sources. Thanks. And hopefully that was not overtime or too short. All right, thanks y'all.
Exactly perfect on time. Thank you, Megs. Perfect. Okay, so thank you so much. Let's just give a virtual round of applause for all of our panelists this morning. And then if I could get all of you to put your cameras back on at this point. We have just about 20 minutes for Q&A, so this should be a really exciting conversation here. Just a reminder to all of you who are attending, I haven't been able to track the Discord, so if there are questions for our panelists, if you could put them in the Zoom Q&A and then we can get to them there. But I'm happy to start things off. I definitely noticed some really interesting themes through all of these presentations. I think there's a lot of exciting places we can go with this. But I think where I'd love to start is I noticed that there's this question of complicity that Sharang brought up in the beginning that I'm kind of seeing surface in all of these different areas in different ways, whether it's, you know, narrative or complicity in capitalism or in sexism or whatever it might be. So I was wondering if any of you would like to share a little more about how you see complicity or even alibi. I know you mentioned alibi, Megs, in your work and in the games that you're analyzing.
I guess
Whoever would like to start.
So I think that like right. So the idea of kind of complicity, I think, is something that I'm kind of thinking about. And kind of right. I didn't kind of get to this because I was trying to go a little bit more quickly, but if you look at some of the stuff that like Elizabeth Hargrave and Eric Lang have kind of said about like kind of the gendered labor of making board games, right? They kind of have some suggestions to be a little bit more kind of intentional about acknowledging like that playtesting is labor. Eric Lang kind of responded to, well, I don't know if I need to get into like this whole story about this sexist board game CEO or COO guy, but basically he kind of acknowledged that like women in his experience, women designers were often like the most cognizant of the idea that actually asking someone to play test your often not good prototype actually is labor. And the idea of kind of like alibi, I think, is also I think something that if we connect it back to Dietering there's kind of an idea of like, oh yeah, you know, I'm pretend in his article he's saying that like often adults like pretend like it's labor when actually they are themselves having fun. But I think that sometimes I think that there's almost a reverse alibi where it's like you know, I'm making my friends or my partner play, you know, or you know, not making, but like I'm really strong, really want my friends or my partners to get into games, and I think that it'll be fun. And sometimes it's not fun, but sometimes people are willing to do it because they want you to, you know, they're like, oh, I'd love to, like, you really want to play this game, I'll play this game. And then ask them to play even more games, like assuming that they can't play a game if they haven't played a bunch of little games is like a little bit, you know, we don't assume that people who just play Twilight Imperium or just play Warhammer or any of those like games, you know, we don't say that those are failures of gateway games to like get people to play other games. It's only Wingspan, Fog of Love, Flamecraft, right? Like really gendered games where we're like, oh, it needs to get somebody into this other market where they can play, you know, the real games. So like kind of not having this alibi of let, you know, just acknowledging like, hey, will you do this for me? Play this one game. You're an adult, like, you know, I think that you can do it rather than trying to create or trying to force your partner to be a gamer.
Do any of you all want to jump in on that as well? I saw some of you nodding. You had some things to say.
I
No.
don't
do
think
have a
I don't think if I have any like specific thing to add that I just like agree mostly on just, and the fact that the kind of interesting the idea of the like the gendered gateway game, and but that since you mentioned Warhammer, I have obligation now to talk about it. Like if you want to get somebody in the Warhammer, it's interesting because it doesn't have. There are like Games Workshop publishes these games that could be called gateway games, but they're historically very bad at being gateway games. Like people, they are mostly played by people who are tired of playing the like big Warhammer. They just like they're the people who are like, I don't want to play this main game anymore. I'm gonna play this small game version, but it does not work as a gateway game because all the players playing it are like veterans of the game who want to play it in a different way. So Games Workshop has like historically been really bad at making any sort of gateway games, and but also historically they have like managed not to do anything like gendered. Their games are interestingly like genderless in that sense.
There's an aspect of complicity with every Games Workshop game as well, isn't there? Because they are explicitly war games, right? There's that aspect of just by playing them, we're saying violence is the right way to solve every problem. There are no Games Workshop games, as far as I know, where you can have peace break out. You know, the whole tagline is that war is always going on, right? And there's no recognition that negotiation or cooperation or compromise are ever a possibility. Everyone who's different from you has to be destroyed. There are obviously huge issues with that, and we obviously like love it and have fun with it somehow. But, you know, I kind of resisted wanting to play any of their stuff for decades, probably because it felt like it was just buying into a very kind of militaristic and, you know, violent and almost imperialistic, hyper-masculine kind of approach to play.
But going off of that, I just want to say like one of the things I find joyful about Warhammer 40K is, and all of Warhammer, I guess we can say, but 40K in particular, is that it says all these things, but it's also very satiric and very much a commentary on it. And I feel like the community I was introduced to it with versus other communities I found, like I feel like the people who are more into the lore, like often when they're playing, like you can sort of tell based on what the armies are. Like if it's just the most basic Marines, then they might just be buying into what's being mocked. Or like if we think of the Cypherus Cain books going with it, like in its never-ending war and violence, it's very much still a critique of that, right? There's a problem, like there are no good guys. Okay, I love the orcs, but there are no good guys in 40K. Everyone's awful, everyone's genocidal, everyone thinks that they're right and will never go for peace, and that's both the absurdity and the problem. And that's something I find really that distance between you and what you're playing with 40K.
Yeah. there's a interesting that's true, and I think that's the like still the mentality that Games Workshop has when it's like doing this game. But I also think they're like failing in that due to framing of the game right now. Like right now, the game is framed very differently than it was framed 10 years ago or 20 years ago even. There's much more. I hesitate. There's not good. It's not. It's not heroic. Might be there is some sort of heroic. They are selling Space Marine sets called Space Marine Heroes, and that word hero carries with itself a certain meaning, as opposed. And then you look what is then opposed to these heroes becomes the more evil. By simply being the opposing part of it, and because we recognize humanity and human features and human stuff as more like akin to us, then what is then opposed to them becomes the other, and this very much relates to queerness and issues of like other minorities whose coding is all over these evil factions.
I think there's this really interesting idea of complicity when it comes to games that deal with violence in the form of warfare versus violence in other forms, right? To quote someone very famous, you exist in the context of all in which you live, right? We have this enormous history of depictions of war, such that I think we become inured to the effects of media about war, and we tend to not think of it critically. Like games are famous, or scholars are famous for claiming that games that ask you to enact terrible things make you critically engage with that terrible thing, right? I believe that to be true in many cases, but for some weird reason, I don't believe that's true for war because of this enormous history of media representative war. Anytime war is depicted or that similar violence, we're like, oh, whatever. We don't think of it critically because it's become the norm, right? Like as Antonio Gramsci writes about, if it becomes the norm, it becomes whatever. And yet when it becomes things we don't have as much representation about, domestic violence, two people trying to communicate and love each other, right? Once we hit those topics, the aspect of complicity that comes into role-playing games, and of course Fog of Love is a semi-role-playing game, like Meg said, we start suddenly becoming more critically thoughtful about it as players, which I think is really interesting and obviously challenging because we've accepted war to such a degree that we don't bat an eye, right?
We do have a few more questions that are popping up now. Sharang, I'll keep it on you right now because Evan had a question for you. Fairy tales are traditionally disciplinary instruments for young teens as they come of age into sexuality. But Bluebeard's Bride seems geared toward an older audience, which has a meta understanding of the tales. So what do we do with this tension?
I mean, that's interesting, right? Because yeah, like fairy tales are classically about it. Like Rumpelstiltskin, some scholars talk about it being about don't masturbate or you'll become sterile, right? Like there are all these like readings of fairy tales about like controlling your sexuality. However, I think the problem that we face in Western society and probably all of society is that we expect once you're no longer a teen, for you're like, yes, you are an adult, you have a good understanding of things. But that is not the case with sexuality, right? The big problem is that many adults don't have, and I'm not saying I am enlightened about sexuality. I probably have the same similar kinds of issues, but many adults in society aren't well versed in thoughts about sexuality and how to engage in it well and thoughtfully and stuff, right? We see this through like issues that come up all the time of like sexual assault and violence and terrible relationships and unethical behavior and things, right? So I think games that exist for adults that discuss these things are still important, right? Because we as adults still need to learn and grapple and engage with these things in open ways. So I think maybe it's a good thing that we have this game that teaches us about sexuality that is marketed not towards teens, so that adults will be interested in playing, right? Goes back to Meg's idea of like, oh, I can only play this game with my kids, tee-hee, right? But here we have a game that's talking about a very adult issue. I don't know the statistics of this, obviously, but because teens don't often live with their intimate partners, incidences of intimate partner violence see a different appear differently, right? But adults often live with their intimate partners, so intimate partner violence again manifest, the phenotype of it is different. And so and we saw this like during the isolation and pandemic, right? Like this was a big issue. So I think having these games actually for adults and not aimed at teens is really, really cool. And that makes an interesting idea that we should make more sex education media for adults who think they know a lot about sex, but actually don't, right? So.
Great, thank you. There was another question that I believe Emily answered already, so I'll just flag that if anyone's interested in checking that out. There's a little conversation about the ephemerality of things like play and streaming. But I also see Danielle in the audience has a hand up. Would you like to ask your question, Danielle? And you are muted if you wanted to ask it out loud, I'm not sure.
Well, Daniel asks, I'm gonna quickly mention under what Sharang said is like how you when came to that from leading from our discussion of Warhammer. It's interesting how there is a fact about like miniature games and I think war games, they are kind of like ludically, and there are ludic limitations kind of on like what they can do, or at least we've like put them up in that sort of sense that miniature games are war games. And that conversation has basically ended there. And the other use for miniatures is basically as like gaming pieces in other games. So I think there probably should be like someone making right now like more, let's say, more challenging and more interesting, like expanding what war game would mean in that sense, and that war game could then possibly tackle subjects other than just war.
Yeah. It looks like our other question, it was just a technical error, so we're not waiting on anyone at this point. I think there's one more here. Okay, we do have a question here. Emily, can you talk more about the layers that having narrative adds to bleed and its potential effects on the audience for Kollok?
No, I think this question of bleed and Kollok is a really good one, and one I'm still sorting through. And this actually goes with the question David Hall was asking in the Q&A, is actually how do we preserve how people reacted to it in playing it? And one of the things is that the server that I'm going to go back and forth between calling it an app, which is how they advertise it, and what it technically is. But in the game, it's a server that you're communicating with each other across the wastelands. But the way you were playing the game in between streams, I don't know how to access that now. I have old screenshots on my old computer that I need to uncover, and maybe when I was tweeting during it, of my character. I'm trying to remember what the heck my character was. Like even now preparing for this, I was like, "Where's my character?" And I'm like, "Oh, my character's gone." So I bring this up because what I think about how do we figure out what bleed was? I feel like the next step would be to try to find other people who played and try to get into discussions. I think we've already had talks about some of the work being done on astral play and surveys at Auburn University. And I think that might be the type of study needs to happen, but I'm actually not sure what the bleed was. I know that there are definitely things that I did feel isolated. I did feel there are different ways I would play it. I think they would give me more support next time, but it's but like you were trying to communicate with people far away through technology, which did feel very real considering it was 2022. And not knowing where you're going and not knowing how things were. So I think I wonder how much the bleed would actually have to do with also the pandemic. So both the playing, but the way of processing emotions related to, well, it's still, the pandemic's not over, but like the pandemic feelings for it. But yeah, I'm curious to see what the bleed would be. Part of the issue though would be finding the community. I need to find the community where people are talking about it. If people are like which might be, I need to go deeper into the Hyper RPG Discord would be a place to look, but I'm actually not sure. That's something I would like to look into in the future.
Great, thank you, Emily. So we have just about 3 minutes left. So I wanted to give you all an opportunity just to share one last closing thought. I'd love to tie it back into kind of our theme of the conference with home, because I did notice, you know, just the concept of home and vulnerability of home and kind of threat to domestic space or national space or things of that sort are kind of a theme in all of these. So if any of you would like to share closing thoughts on that theme, please feel free.
I think the danger, like we tend to think of dangers as external and the home as this like safe place, right? So I think, and we talk about house invasion in the United States, for example, as like this horrific, scary breach of that, right? And so I think we don't, as a society in the United States, at least, because that's the context I live in and have grown up a lot in. We tend to not think about dangers that come from within the social sphere of the home, and we tend to not want to talk about that a lot, like child abuse and domestic violence and things. And I think it's really powerful that independent games are trying to explore this, right? Like I'm thinking of, in addition to Bluebeard's Bride, which is about domestic violence, there's this game, One Child's Heart, which is about child abuse, right? You play as as workers who are like psychologists and service workers and stuff who go inside the minds of children to uncover what's causing them trauma, and you try and help them with their issues. And often it's about like child abuse stuff. So I think it's really powerful that games are discussing this part of the home that's under discussed, and only good things can come from us thinking critically about these issues more.
Yeah, it's a great point. Thank you, Sharang. Anyone else want to chime in on that? Any final thoughts at all? Oh, Megs, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I just think like tying it back to home and like the idea that like acknowledging that like our idea of domesticity, like our idea of home is something that is curated, right? And that it's something that people have to work to curate, right? And that's like not I'm thinking of another I'm forgetting the name of the panelist, but someone was talking last time, the person talking about like the evolution of like board gaming tables, right? And how there's a lot of like barriers in terms of class and capital in terms of like trying to bring things into the home as opposed to going out and like finding things outside. So just the idea that not every home can be like a game home.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, then we are at 11 o'clock exactly, so we will close it there. One last virtual round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. This was a really excellent panel. And now we can take a nice break. You got 30 minutes, and we will see you all back here at 11:30. Thank you all so much.
And thank you everyone for the gift of your attention.
Oh.